just came in. Again, this is Redefining Allyship among Indigenous Communities and Academia. My name is Jeff Shepard. I'm the chair of the Department of History at UTEP. I'd like to thank so many people. This is really a great collaborative effort. I apologize if I overlook anyone, but I'd like to thank EPCC, particularly Yadira Corral, and the great team at Isleta del Sur Pueblo that organized and coordinated the event. Brenda Gutierrez, Stephanie Paz, Stormy Gomez, and Sarai Argumento. I was just really touched and amazed at all of the hard work that you've put into this this 2-week series of panels. The attendance last week has been really great. The conversations have been very, very engaging. So I'm really happy to be able to participate. I'd also like to recognize Arise for all of your hard work, and my colleague Dr. Yolanda Leyva in the History Department, and Dino Hearn from the College of Liberal Arts. The college has kind of co-sponsored the event. So our panel today consists of a great group of speakers, each of whom has important things to say about building and nurturing positive relationships between Native nations and colleges and universities. Productive partnerships are important for various reasons, not the least of which is because these institutions sit on Indigenous land. In the Indigenous land acknowledgement statements that have been embraced across the world, there has been an increasingly common understanding that settler colonial societies must reckon with the legacies of their histories. That reckoning involves an acknowledgement of histories of displacement, violence, and marginalization. Additionally, universities are moving beyond these statements, which are important for healing, towards positive and substantive change in outreach, collaboration, curriculum building, hiring, and other measures to make universities accountable to and supportive of Native nations. It is my hope that this panel will help us move towards an acknowledgement that institutions of higher learning truly do have an obligation to the Indigenous peoples on whose land we teach, work, research, and learn. So I would now like to introduce the speakers in our panel. And what we'll do is I'll introduce everybody, and then I'll have a series of questions for each person. And after that round, we'll stop for a little while, pause, and see if there's some questions and some discussion, and then from the audience. And then we have another series of questions. So there's a lot to discuss here, and so let's get to it. So our first presenter, panelist, is Eric Henson. He's a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and has been a research fellow affiliate with the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development since 1998. Mr. Henson has taught Native Americans in the 21st century. Sounds like a wonderful course I'd love to enroll in, and serves as a visiting senior scholar at the Harvard University Native American Program. In his role at the Harvard Project, Mr. Henson has served as an evaluator for an awards program, identifies, evaluates, and honors best practices in tribal governance across the United States. He is also an executive vice president with the economics consulting firm Compass Lexicon. Mr. Henson holds a master's degree in public policy from the JFK School of Government at Harvard and an MA in economics from Southern Methodist University, a BBA in business economics from the University of Texas at San Antonio. Mr. Henson is a primary author of The State of Native Nations, Conditions under U.S. Policies of Self-Determination, which was published by Oxford University Press. He has also provided testimony to the U.S. Congress on several occasions on issues relating to tribal governance and economic development. Our second panelist is Patricia Riggs, who is a citizen of Isleta del Sur Pueblo. I almost think that she doesn't need introductions, that so many people are aware of her accomplishments. But she served as the Isleta del Sur Pueblo Director of Economic Development, where she advanced the economic development strategic goals of YDSP by securing financial resources infrastructure, partnerships, and policy. Under her direction, YDSP was a recipient of a Harvard Project Honoring Nations Award for Project Pueblo, Economic Revitalization. Patricia Pat has also served as a YDSP Court Project Coordinator and Court Administrator, where she developed legal codes and established the YDSP court system. Additionally, Pat has supported health entities with project development, policy writing, and strategic planning, and assisted organizations such as the Native Nations Institute, Harvard Project on American Indians. Her research interests include how colonization impacted the economy and culture of YDSP. She also supports YDSP and other nations to move beyond colonization and to rebuild the tribal nations. Our third panelist is Yadira Corral, who holds a master's degree in higher education administration. She has experience working in higher education since 2010 through various positions, including teaching education courses. She also joined EPCC's College Student Leadership and Campus Life Department in 2016. As a campus life representative, she has created multiple events, such as this one, that embrace our community's diversity. So we're very happy to have her participate. And our fourth panelist is Dean Dennis O'Hearn from the College of Liberal Arts at UTEP. Dean O'Hearn was born in Carlsbad, New Mexico. His grandmother, Maria Socorina, was Unangan from the island of Unalaska, the Aleutian chain off of Alaska. He gained graduate degrees in economics, Russian and Eastern European studies, and sociology from the University of Michigan. After a university career that took him to many countries, including Ireland and Turkey, he became Dean of Liberal Arts at UTEP in 2018. His research is mainly focused on the effects of transnational corporations on socioeconomic development in poor countries and, recently, on long-term isolation of prisoners. His most recent book, Living at the Edges of Capitalism, records attempts of people to escape capitalism and build societies based on cooperation and mutual aid. So we really have a wonderful panel today. So we're going to get started with Eric Hansen, and we're going to start with Eric, with you, for a couple really sort of a big picture question that helps us get a sense of the overall landscape and relations between universities and tribal peoples. So that question, what approach can colleges and universities take to the research interactions with Native Indigenous peoples that is reflective of good allyship?
Hi, everybody. Pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the question. You know, the one thing that I think is easiest to latch onto is just a recharacterization of how universities work with tribes or tribal departments, tribal entities, indigenous groups. If you recast how it has historically been, so that you think of it as working or researching with tribes or with indigenous people, as opposed to doing research on them or about them, that mindset alone really alters the kind of outcomes you get. My experience is drawn largely from Harvard the last 24 years. I was a student there for a couple of years and then a research fellow there for more than 2 decades. Also some work I've done with the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona. And one distinguishing thing that is clear from both of those institutions, and in my experience there, is that they view their work with tribes sort of being on behalf of tribes as opposed to being about tribes or learning something that tribes and Native people can't already tell us. And so it's much more a synthesis of information that is out there from and in collaboration with people, and then more or less using the university setting to help tell those stories, share success stories, broadly pollinate best practices from one tribe or one tribal nation to another. And that recharacterization of just the approach really sets you up to do that in a way that has not always been the case.
Great. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate just a little bit on that. You're talking about collaboration, for instance, and one of the ways perhaps that colleges and universities can collaborate is on things like course offerings. So what are some course offerings that you've seen that seem really pretty productive in terms of collaboration?
Sure. So I'll start with the course I teach now as an example, and then maybe speak a little bit more broadly. One thing, my class is a community-based or field-based course where it's a semester-long research project where we ask tribes and tribal entities, do you have a problem or an issue that you'd like some extra manpower to help you out with? And we bring students from all across the university. Harvard University is made up of 10 different parts: the undergraduate college, the School of Business, the medical school, the School of Government where I went as a student, et cetera, et cetera. And the course is open across the entire range of the university, which is also, I think, an important characteristic because you bring a very broad perspective from the students, including graduate students, and they often have substantial experience. Some of the students in my course last semester have 20 years of experience. I had a DOJ lawyer who's got 20 plus years in the Department of Justice working on issues of financial security for elderly people. And so you bring this kind of question to tribes and Native nations. Are there problems that we could help you with? That's the entire curriculum in a sense. And what you find is many nations, even if they've done well, a given department, their economic development department or their transportation department might have 14 things they'd like to take on in a given year, but maybe not the manpower. So if there's one or two of those that are a nice match with some of our students, you pair up students, often highly qualified professionals, to help tribes or Native nations take on these issues that are already real problems that they're trying to deal with, and give them this independent view. So that's one example of how it's really working with tribes. There's no curriculum that I'm mandating that anyone adhere to. It's responding to what the tribal nations out there are looking for assistance with. And I think that kind of theme echoes through the best course offerings. I personally been finding classes or curriculum that deal with Native issues only to a Native American Affairs department or Native Studies is also a little bit short-sighted. The Native perspective can inform every single aspect of life. There's no reason why Harvard Law School can't have a much more rich learning experience for a broad array of students if it provides classes that have some focus on Native American issues, the legal history, the history in the law between tribes and the U.S. federal government is ripe with case studies that apply in many different instances. And so it's integrating curriculum throughout the university, not just confining it to maybe the history department or maybe just a Native Studies department.
Thank you, and I think that's if you look at sort of the long sort of arc of Indigenous and Native studies in universities over the past maybe 50, almost 60 years now, you do see that shift from multiple departments to maybe social sciences and humanities, and then maybe back out again, and most recently more directly in collaboration with Native communities. And so shifting that paradigm is really important. So I want to move to Pat, and I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these questions that we raised right now. A lot of these issues really are related. So Pat, I have a couple questions for you. So kind of elaborating upon what Eric has discussed, you have experience working with various universities. So can you tell us a little bit about the support YDSP has received, associated projects and outcomes for the Pueblo? So Pat?
Muted. Are you there?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I thought I was muted by the moderator, but I muted myself eventually. So, Okay, so thank you for allowing me to be here and represent Isleta del Pueblo. Yes, we have worked with several tribes, and in my capacity, I have worked on particular projects. And we are actually a recipient of Harvard Project Services and Student Services. And I first met Joe Calt of Harvard Project when the Speaking Rock Casino had closed down, and we were having basically a financial crisis. So we wanted to establish a new method for overseeing our economy. And so anyway, long story short, I met Joe Colt, and he supported us by working with our tribe in various capacities. One of the things they did is they did send a student project here, and one of the students actually was a citizen of El Paso, and they supported us by helping us evaluate our legal infrastructure and what modifications could be made to support economic development. So the other thing that we did is we did a whole series of trainings for the tribe and tribal council. And so in the end, we went on to win Harvard Project Honoring Nations program for Project Pueblo. The other organization or university that we've worked with is Native Nations Institute, which is a sister organization of the Harvard Project. So we worked on various things with them. One of the things that most definitely stands out is how they supported us to do strategic planning, and in a way that supported our tribe to find our own solutions to our own problems. And there was several things that came out of some of the training. One was removing the blood quantum from our tribe and going to descendancy, which allowed our descendants to enroll where they weren't supported with citizenship. So the other thing is we also piloted a long distance learning project, which actually allows nations from across the country to build their capacity. But now in this day and age of COVID, it's come in really supportive of tribes. And the last university that we worked with is University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and they have an institute that is the Indigenous Planning Institute, Indigenous Planning and Design Institute, and we work with them on developing a land use code where that we could create a sense of place for our tribe, and that we could create a future or a plan for our future and how we would use our resources, and also build different hubs within our community and learning center and places of protection of our land, but also address residential and business areas as well. So I think that what these three universities all have in common is that they made a real investment in Indigenous communities. They also made a real investment in supporting Native students. And not only do they just have classes and courses, they built institutions within their universities that supports Native communities and Indigenous students for the long term. And what they're in working with other universities, that investment wasn't there. And what happens is that there are some really supportive individuals or staff and faculty that try to support, but without that investment from the top layer of the university system, it's not able to sustain itself. So if I would say anything, it's really about universities recognizing that need and really investing.
Thank you. So I wanted to kind of follow up on something that we're discussing here. And so what are some of the principles of policy or conduct that a university should consider when partnering with tribes? You talked a little bit about this, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate on it. What the policies or principles should guide university interaction and collaboration with Native nations?
One, I think that they need to recognize that we're sovereign nations, and they need to treat tribes and in the same manner as they would local governments, right? And that when they're working with local governments, they really address what kind of challenges that local governments are having. So we have the same challenges, but we also have challenges that are unique to our community. So I also think that they need to recognize that they can't play a role as a patriarch. They have to help us identify our own needs, but they can help us to build that capacity. We have the same kind of issues as other governments. For example, we have economic development needs, we have health programs, we have social service programs, court systems, and police systems, right? And universities also support the capability building for those areas. So I think that if they recognize that they can support us in those areas, but do it in a manner that helps us move and advance ourselves as a people and be able to sustain ourselves. I think that's what they can do and think about when partnering with tribes.
Thank you. So I have a few minutes. I want to loop back to a more localized question, sort of in conversation with what Dean O'Hearn may talk about. So I'll loop back to a kind of a local discussion here in a moment. So I want to shift to Yadira.
Yeah, I'm actually here, but I'm having trouble with my video.
Okay.
This is
We'll
Dennis.
do the best we can. So Yadira, thank you for joining us and organizing and putting so much time and effort into this. So we're going to ask you a few questions here from your perspective, working very directly with students and student activities. What impact do stereotypes and assumptions have on minority groups in education? You know, and in particular, what are some of the stereotypes that you've seen that faculty, staff, and some students have regarding Native students that cause maybe some challenges, or what are some areas of re-education, perhaps, on the point of stereotypes?
Yes, it's a very complex topic. I believe it's very important for us to understand how those ideas that are so engraved sometimes in the society can affect the academic performance of students. So first, most institutions have what it's called like a predominantly white culture. So when you have a student from a minority group joining these institutions, they tend to leave behind their own culture and identity so they can integrate into these new institutions. And by doing that, sometimes they feel isolated or lonely, or they don't feel that sense of belonging, and that also affects their performance. Stereotypes and assumptions also create a lot of pressure in students, since in the classroom sometimes we have diversity discussions, and sometimes people, students, and faculty members tend to point to these students as a point of reference to represent their entire community and ethnicity. So these ideas also create a lot of stress in students as they start to create this image that their personal decisions and actions reflects on their whole community. And there's like a kind of like a phenomenon that happens in minority groups, that they start developing this proving process, which is them trying to prove to their peers that they are capable and that they deserve being in that classroom, learning what they're learning, and they push themselves to be better. This pressure can also create a lot of anxiety, and it will impact on their academic performance. I am not a native person, but I can relate a lot to this, and I'll use it back to my experience in university. I grew up in Mexico, so when I came over, there's like all this concept, right, that the stereotypes that Mexicans are lazy, that we are copying off our peers and things like that. So that starts creating a lot of pressure in a student to be better, to prove them that you have earned your place there. And as we have spoken before, or we discussed with the impact team, natives here in our community also have a lot of stereotypes that they don't need to work, that they get paid for everything, housing, school, and that's a lot of pressure for them. So we need to acknowledge these pressures that we put on our students so that we can help them get through college, and we can also serve them better.
Thank you. Yeah, I was 2 years ago. I was at the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association conference, and it happened to be in New Zealand. And one of the presenters, team, talked about training workshops for faculty, staff, and students to kind of educate them on Indigenous histories and Indigenous cultures and what it was like to be Indigenous in institutions. And they had some pushback, and it was a little bit difficult for them to address some of these topics. And I think frequently it would be useful if we had workshops like that talked about settler colonialism, that talked about stereotypes and how to improve the campus climate for students. So how about one more question, and then we'll shift to Dean O'Hearn. The goal of student activities is to engage students outside of the classroom. So how do you envision some of these activities impacting and really improving campus climate for Indigenous students? I know that ARISE, Academic Revival of Indigenous Studies and Education, has worked to raise awareness about Native histories and cultures at UTEP, but they have had some challenges. So I'm wondering if you could speak to how to improve campus climate for Indigenous students.
I think engaging students outside the classroom is essential to improve our cultural climate in our institutions. Also, it's very important to reinforce the learning outcomes in our students, and to improve also retention by creating a sense of belonging and connection to the campus community. What I've seen in my experience, I'll use last year's event that we were able to have on campus. We have, and I have talked about a little bit about this before. From my point of view, here in El Paso, it's people tend to believe that we all have a similar background or the same background, and we don't necessarily do. Last year, we had the first Indigenous People Celebration event, and it was very well attended, and also we had a lot of students coming up to us and sharing their background. And even then, I was very surprised, because there was this one student in particular that often visited our office, and he just said that he was coming from Mexico City. So my thought was, like, we have the same background, right, or very similar backgrounds. And the day of the event, he shared with us that he was actually Mayan, and that he was sharing his culture with us. And he shared that his mom would travel around the world, sharing her knowledge and medicine with other students. And we also had different faculty and staff coming down to the event and saying, you know what, I'm a Tiwa, and I'm very happy to see an event like this, having people paying attention to our history and our knowledge as a community. And I think that even if we have some gaps in the classroom or as an institution, having student activities that acknowledge all the diversity in our community will also help students feel recognized and welcome in our institutions. So I think that's very important to have these activities, even like we also have a Hispanic Heritage event last year, and we focus in different parts of Latin America, and we were happy to see a lot of engagement from our English as a second language program. We had people from Ecuador, from Colombia, from Venezuela, and many other countries coming to our office and saying we want to participate and we want to show you our traditional dances. And even we had a student from Puerto Rico. She was very excited, and she brought all the Puerto Rican community here in El Paso, and they had dances and candies, and they had a booth displaying like their traditional dresses and so on. So student activities can be very engaging to students to kind of like help them feel connected to our institutions.
Yes, thank you. That's often sometimes overlooked as a sense of belonging and a sense of openness and nurturing and cultivating that feeling that the institution values Native students on campus and not just delivering content in a class. So I'd like to thank you very much, Yadira. Thank you. I'd like to shift to Dean O'Hearn. And so so that you know, Dean, we did introductions for everybody at the beginning, and so everybody knows who you are. So one of the questions for you kind of shifts to the more local context of UTEP, and I may ask Pat to contribute here. So how do you view the state of Indigenous studies and Indigenous life at UTEP, and in particular in the College of Liberal Arts?
Thanks, Jeff. I hope you can hear me if you can't see me, and I do apologize for various difficulties that kept me away, but I'm glad to be here. I was really interested to hear some of Yadira's comments, and I think, you know, she was pointing to something that is absolutely crucial. It has to do with the way that the campus becomes an inviting place for students really of every kind. Before I was here, I spent a couple of years in Texas A&M, and one thing that was really my top priority was to try and create an environment for Latinx students there that was inviting, in which they felt like they really belonged. And unfortunately, I think we had very limited success in doing that. Here at UTEP, I think it is a much more welcoming campus atmosphere, and I've been really very impressed by the work of Arise and the degree to which we're beginning to have more of a presence of an Indigenous voice on the campus. But we still have a long, long way to go. And I guess that would go across many things. I mean, one is that, you know, we have a handful of faculty who are interested in Indigenous studies. It's great that we have a handful, but it would be nice to have a little bit more than a handful. As somebody that grew up in New Mexico, as I think you probably told people earlier, I've always been struck by the differences between New Mexico and Texas in terms of the understanding and even just the recognition of Indigenous issues and even Indigenous people. Texas seems to live in this kind of never land where it's as if, you know, the Indigenous people never existed here. And El Paso is a little bit different. And I think it's important, you know, that we can take a leading role. I'm really glad to see that Austin now is starting to do some things as well. but I think, you know, what we need to do, and of course you've begun it, Jeff, by doing the work on the land acknowledgement statement, which we fully support in the college. The good side, I think, is that just practically everybody in the college is very supportive of Indigenous studies. The other side of it, of course, is getting the curriculum so it actually works, so that we get enough people to take courses to make this to be a sustainable activity. So now we have some courses which kind of touch on Indigenous studies, but they're somewhat marginal. And, you know, I would like to see a day in which we can create programs, curricula, and so on that will really put Indigenous studies at the center, as we have tried to do as well with, of course, Chicanic studies, with African American studies, and really to put it on an equal plane with some of the other programs.
So thank you. So I wanted to again bring Pat back into this. You know, we've talked at length about some of the missed opportunities for UTEP, particularly with Isleta del Sur Pueblo. So Pat, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit and openly, because these are times where we need to have, you know, blunt and direct conversations. So how do you view the possibilities for relations between UTEP and Isleta and other Native nations? What would you suggest, perhaps? I'll just sort of leave it open to you.
Well, I think for starters, I think that UTEP has to acknowledge the first peoples of the region, right? They need to acknowledge that the institution that they sit on, it rests on the land of these first peoples, and most notably the Tigwa and also other tribes as well. But I think that that's the first step to building a true relationship, right? We have to build these interrelationships in order for us to have a sense of understanding and create a place, and also that to UTEP, or not just UTEP, any university to reflect that they are understanding. And because I think if you don't do that to begin with, then you marginalize us as a people, and we've already been marginalized for centuries. And like Yadira spoke to all the stereotypes and stuff, that's where we start to actually break those stereotypes and build relationships. I think they need to engage us as a community. They need to make sure that the people that work for them also have some sort of reflection of us as Indigenous people. They can start by hiring at least, you know, a small staff of faculty and staff as well. There needs to be some sort of training, definitely, to ensure that the research that is conducted on Native peoples meets the needs of Indigenous people. And I can't tell you how many times that there have been theses and other projects that have where students or different departments collaborate with the tribe, but it doesn't really truly reflect what our needs are, right? And then so somebody gets their PhD, but often we don't get any sort of benefit from it, or we don't even get a copy sometimes. Or so I just think that really to try to understand us, there also needs to be some sort of education for staff as well.
Thank you. I agree. Of course. I mean, you and I, we've talked about this for a while. I got here in 2002 from Arizona State University, And from the top, there was a liaison in the president's office, that was Peterson Za, all the way down to about 28 to 30 Indigenous faculty and upwards near 3,000 Native students. Now, admittedly, the scale is slightly different at ASU, and Arizona's history is different than Texas, but nonetheless, the educational curve here has been huge. I mean, most recently, just to get a UTEP news report, a campus news report on this event, took incredible effort. The dean had to weigh in on the communications department to do a story. Finally, the story came up today, and it's on our news feed. And then there's some things that are wrong in that. And so the basic education level here is really, there's a lot to be done here. And so I really wish that we could make some positive traction here, but I think that these conversations are hopefully a step in that direction. So we have a number of lots of different comments, but I want to pause for a moment and ask if there are any questions from the audience, from the participants. I saw in one of the questions had to do with demographics, essentially what percentage, or not even percentage, but how many numbers of students that self-identify as an Indigenous are at EPCC and at UTEP. That was one particular question. Since I've been here for 18 years, and that number has not exceeded 50. And we've gone from about 17,000 to 25,000 students. Now, I don't know what kind of percentage that is, but I think it's 0.00 something. So that's one question, is how do we improve recruitment? So if I could kind of, unless there are any other questions, I'm not seeing any additional hands go up or any questions. I'd like to ask the panelists if you could speak a little bit about outreach and recruitment and retention. What are some of the suggestions or best practices you might have regarding outreach and recruitment? Eric.
So one thing Harvard does through its Harvard University Native American program, it has 2 staffers full-time who've been around for quite a while, who are more or less in charge of recruitment. And maybe Harvard's not the first institution that people think of as a viable option for them if they're Native students. I mean, small towns, rural locations, maybe it just seems unobtainable. But there's some proactive outreach, and there are people with dedicated jobs specifically on recruitment of prospective students. And one thing that the school has done, I'd say to varying degrees, is have a space for Native students. When I was a grad student here, the ed school had set aside, there's several old houses that are historical and old on the campus, and one of them had a dedicated floor for Native students basically to hang out. And it wasn't like you couldn't come by if you weren't registered in the university and a Native student. It was the physical space itself, it felt like this old home. It was very homey. It was very welcoming. And I've literally run into people who aren't even Native, but had Native friends at Harvard in their studies. I have these incredibly fond memories 20 years later of the time I spent at Reed House. It just felt like this sort of cozy study. And they'd have, Friday night chips and pizza night and different presentations. And it was a space if you didn't, urban setting of a university, sometimes you don't have a place to just park and do your homework. And it was just such a friendly place. And I was there for about a decade. And when the ed school repurposed that for other uses, the American program moved into what looks a little bit more like an office space. But it's still a good space. It's dedicated to the Native American program, and people are interested in the various offerings that intersect with Indigenous people. It's got a nice large conference room and a staff that is there and offices and really like a lounge area that's kind of in the common space. So it's nice to just have this place. It's not quite, in my mind, as homey and as welcoming as the Reed House, and not every place will have a 400-year-old home that provides that kind of venue. But I would say that universities that think a little bit about not just attracting good students, but reinforcing to them continuously, if there's a place here for you, even if it's just you need to make phone calls, we got a quiet place. You need to do your homework, we got a couple computers you can use. And it lets them have a bunch of people who've been at the university for a long time, have trusted individuals they can just check into as their progress, maybe waxes and wanes through their years at the school.
Thank you. So I think Dean O'Hearn has his hand up. And amusing that the dean has raising his hand.
Yeah, I'm getting used to this, but it's it's in the tradition of leading by obeying, as we learned with the Zapatistas. I think it's a good tradition. So I'm happy to put my hand up and allow myself to be recognized. I was very interested in several of the comments that have been said there. I mean, it is extremely important, first of all, to recognize, and second of all, to engage. One thing that we've been doing in the last couple of years since I've been here at UTEP is trying to put community engagement at the very top of our agenda. UTEP prides itself in access, but it's always seen access as inviting poor students and students of color and so on to come onto the campus. But I don't think we've really done the full idea of access, which says, no, it's a two-way street. We have to get off of the campus and go out into communities and engage them. And of course, one of the main communities that we really have to engage are the Native American communities on both sides of the border. And that's something, that I think we have really at the top of our agenda. When we go out, of course, it's not about going out and presenting, this is what we can do for you. It's about listening. So the second, or I guess the third, recognition, engagement, and the third part of it is to listen. And if you listen to the community and actually respond to what the needs of the community are and the interests of the community are, rather than, how we as a group of academics can help you, then we're going to get a lot further. And I guess the other part of it is really environment. This is what I was talking about that we tried to achieve at A&M, and it's very much like what Eric was saying. You have to have a space where people can be safe, where they can come and they can come together and discuss things with each other. And I think that that's an extremely important thing. But even going beyond that, probably the most impressive thing I've seen is the campus at the University of British Columbia, which has basically fully recognized that it is a campus which is on Indian territory. And, there are monuments all over it, which are, totem poles and other monuments, which recognize the primacy of Indigenous people to the existence of the University of British Columbia. And, of course, that would be the optimal situation where we fully recognize that this is indeed an Indigenous space. And of course, I don't know if anybody ever did it before I came here, but I do try to make a statement at the beginning, as we hear much more in Canada than we do in North America or than in the United States, of the acknowledgement of the land being the land of the people who were here so long before us. So those things I think are absolutely crucial in getting recruitment and engagement, is to show that we actually have some kind of a connection with Native American students, both here and further away. And then we also have to do teaching things. We have to teach stuff which is relevant. And that's an important part of it as well. So, hopefully we will make these steps. It requires some interest. I think we have some interest now in UTEP in doing these things, and particularly in the College of Liberal Arts. So I'm hoping that we can begin to make these steps to make it a welcoming and a positive and an exciting environment for Indigenous students to come and work here.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have some comments from Yadira and Pat. So Yadira and then Pat.
I just wanted to add and kind of refer to the question that Liz has here on the chat. She's asking, what can university do to make us feel more welcome and less threatened? And what are they doing to retain an incredibly small percentage of Indigenous peoples they get? So I believe that we need to educate our faculty and staff. We are the ones that are in the front lines, right? We're the ones that have direct contact with students. But I think it's not just about saying, getting some type of training or workshop. Is actually getting in communication and open that communication channel with the different communities. For instance, here in El Paso, with Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and have the direct answers from them. Like, what is it that you're looking when you are going to attend or you're going to enroll in a community college or a university? What is it that you're looking for? What are we lacking? Asking these questions directly more than I think that's more important than us maybe like putting together some workshop out of a book. Well, this book says this, right? I think it's more important to approach it from like a face-to-face communication. Like, okay, you tell me what we can do for you. How can we help you, and how can we help the students transition to a university, or if they are coming from high school, how can we help them complete their education? I think that's the first step that we need to do to engage and retain our students.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pat?
Well, I think that UTEP, or I mean, since we're speaking of UTEP and EPCC and the local institutions can do, they need to do more than just recruitment. I think they need to be champions of education for Indigenous people. I think that if you look at us as a community, and we in the 1960s, I mean, we were extremely living in deep poverty and dire conditions, and our educational level was 5th grade. And over the years, it's grown to where we have now 83 or 84% of our citizens are now high school graduates, and we have 50% bachelor's degree or higher. But all of that really came from within. We developed different programs and encourage people, and also support scholarships for our tribal members to further their education. And I mean, we've had programs such as the Empowerment Department who really, really work hard. They're working from within to teach now areas such as STEM, which not only include the sciences and engineering things, but they're coming from a perspective of our cultural value and our sciences and agriculture and things like that to teach our children. So I really think that also universities, they need to validate like our people as far as what as our intellect is. And often there's even court cases that say that our history is oral, so therefore it's not valid. But if a scholar goes onto the reservation and writes it down because that Native person told them that, then they can validate it. But they need that validation needs to come from us, right? And it needs to be supported by institutions. So I just think that there's so many ways that they can help us to build our capacity, but in a way that works for us. And so, yes, like agreeing with Dita, I think that they do need to come onto our reservations, and they do need to engage our communities. And And that would be a true reflection of commitment and building those relationships.
Thank you. I'm trying to track some of the comments in the chat section. So there really needs to be not just an education, but a somewhat radical transformation in where the relationships are anchored. Universities tend to view themselves as the primary producers of knowledge, and that sort of discourse really needs to change. As you're saying, that scholars aren't the ones that should be validating Indigenous knowledge. Indigenous people's knowledge is inherently valuable. And I think that's a really big shift for universities. Just the notion of Indigenous research protocols or Indigenous IRBs. The fact that the universities, if you're a researcher, you have to run this gauntlet of systems and protocols to get your work approved in the university. But then the assumption is that Indigenous peoples will just go along with it. But I think that you've seen more and more over the past at least 2 decades, for sure, Indigenous research protocols overseen by cultural resources departments, where researchers are being vetted. You have to fulfill a particular number of objectives. Like you said, Pat, that people do their research and then they never return. They don't share their work. They don't ask for consultation. They talk about things like sacred sites and cultural knowledge as if it was just like a newspaper article. So I think that there's a big shift that needs to occur, and I'm hopeful that conversations like this can move us in a good direction. So I'm going to try to look in the chat here. I'm not very good with this. So Yadira, you're really pretty good. I don't know if you see any Q&A or chat questions. If not, I have a 1 or 2 more to ask our panelists.
Yes, we have a comment from Argumedo, and she said that's exactly what you, Yadira Enrique, did with us when it came to organizing Indigenous peoples in the borderland. Thank you for asking us what we wanted rather than assuming or imposing ideas. It's a comment. And for questions, it's still pending for Liz. I'll get back to you on that, Liz. And she would like to, she's curious to know what is the percentage of enroll versus completion rates at other institutions.
This is really critical data. Some of it, though, it's very difficult to get at because there's privacy rights and protections. As I mentioned, I've asked our university for information on the numbers of self-identified Indigenous students, and they'll just give numbers. And so I think at the beginning there would have to be a discussion about Indigenous students being open to participating in a project that follows their life and completion. So I think there has to be a particular sort of structure and mechanism set up in advance. I don't know, Eric or Pat, if y'all want to discuss that on a national level or in any of the capacities you're familiar with, the sort of completion rates.
I don't know the answer for that at Harvard. I just put in the chat that I don't know the exact percentages much because of like the data problems you were mentioning. But HUNAP hosts a graduation ceremony that's kind of separate, that is optional for Native students if they care to attend. It's not purely like the 574 federally recognized tribes, they're Polynesians and et cetera, et cetera. And last year, I think there were about 38 students from across the university who participated in that ceremony. And the school has, I think between the 10 parts of the school, something close to 25,000 people attending each year. That's attendance, though, versus, a subset of graduates who then opt into this native recognition of the graduation ceremony.
Pat, do you have any thoughts on that? Numbers and percentages of Indigenous students entering and completion?
Well, I really don't have the data on that, but I can tell you that every year the number of students is growing of Isleta del Sur Pueblo attending both EPCC and UTEP. I think that, when I was growing up, I knew of one person that had a degree. This is like when I was in high school. One person that actually had a degree and one person that went to college. And now every day we see, or every year we see more students graduating from Isleta del Sur Pueblo and also coming back to run programs. So I think that, as far like off the top of my head, I probably know of at least 40 tribal members that have college degrees and at least 25 from UTEP. And many of those, of course, started at community college. And I'm one of those people, right? I started as community college, and as I gained confidence, I kept moving. Finally, I got an MBA. But it just, I just want to say that it just, it's really so enlightening to see these young people really just take control, and they're doing these really, really good things for our community now. And oftentimes, when I went to university, well, I'm a late bloomer, so I was a little older, but these young kids they don't have role models at the university. I know that several times I actually had to defend the tribe because just out of the blue, somebody would just start making comments about the tribe. So, and there was nobody else that really at the university level that could even speak to that. So, I'm just really, really proud of what Isleta del Sur Pueblo and the Empowerment Department, the Education Department has really put out there, and how they've really what they're doing for the community.
I'd add to that, I'm also initially a junior college student. I went to Midland College in Midland, Texas, a year and a half after high school. And one thing that tribes are really doing across the board is they get more and more control of their own resources and have some means that really nearly universally getting behind supporting higher education for their students. So that's great because it provides this springboard for which many opportunities are open. Just having that doesn't necessarily mean that kids who grow up in a setting where automatically going to college is presumed inside each household. Just knowing that your tuition will be covered doesn't get you to Princeton necessarily. Even if you decide to go, it certainly doesn't guarantee the kind of support network that might help you succeed once you're there. So there are a number of tribes I know of anecdotally where they will cover your tuition anywhere in the world you want to go. The uptake among their native youth is surprisingly low, and their success if they go particularly far away is not necessarily guaranteed. So there are several different ways in which tribes and universities that accept those students can sort of approach success. You need to take it on from every angle nearly to make sure that each student has a good shot of getting through. I think a lot of universities sort of see it as like, well, we got intake and that's good because that brings tuition dollars, but we don't really have many mechanisms, particularly really big schools with 50,000 students. We don't necessarily have mechanisms to devote resources internally to the success of every single student. And underrepresented communities in particular often need that. Just the number of first generation college students from a given tribe might be extremely low in any given year. So there's no one back home to even call up and say, how did you do it? How did you get through? How was it? Where should I go?
Thank you. This is all really very helpful. I'm glad we're recording this because I'm taking notes here, but I would like to record this and pull this information together, and at least speaking for, I don't know if I should speak for all of UTEP, but I will, that we need to have a more engaged, focused, and sustained conversation on this. I find that sometimes things pop up on administration's radar, and then they get sort of pushed aside, pushed onto the back burner as we're dealing with so many different things. One of the questions I have is sort of about advisory groups, Native advisory groups to universities, to try to encourage that automatic process of engagement and consultation, free, prior, informed consent. For instance, with our land acknowledgement statement, there's a tendency, I think, for universities to create that inside the university and then give them to the university. And so I'd sent out, for instance, our land acknowledgement statement a while back. I want to come back to that. But I get concerned that, within the university sort of bubble, it makes decisions without that kind of consultation. So in terms of moving forward, are there models for that? I know up in Montana State University, the president of Montana State University, she has a tribal advisory group where the nations meet with her once or twice a year to discuss various issues. And I'm curious if something like that has been replicated or might seem fruitful here at UTEP and EPCC. If there's any comments or that, or if we're starting to get tired.
Yes. No, yes, definitely. I think we should collaborate, especially here in El Paso. It's so common to have students start at EPCC and then they transfer out to UTEP or New Mexico State. And definitely we should come together to put something like a support system for our students, make sure they transition smoothly through the institutions and they complete their academic goals.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Oh, real quick, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I was going to say on your question, I don't think Harvard has an advisory council at the university level at all, but in sort of different little slices, it's what you're talking about is something we do practice, like at the Honoring Nations, the governance award program we administer through the Kennedy School. I'm one of the site visitors every year, and in fact, I did the site visit to Isleta del Sur, which is where I first met Pat all those years ago. But the site visitors aren't really, in a sense, the judges. We have an independent set of people who are not otherwise affiliated with the university, prominent Native people from all walks of life, who are the board that we present our finalists to, and the decision rests with those sort of esteemed leaders from outside. And one example, you might know his name, he just passed away a couple of weeks ago, Dave Gipp, who is a real strong voice in the Native college systems. So he was on our board for the Honoring Nations Awards. So in a sense, the internal staff would just do the legwork, if you will, and then would present our findings for these different potential honorees, and that board would help us with a broad perspective from throughout Indian country, decide those that are truly worthy of like the highest honors. And that's one way, like on a slightly smaller scale, you can tap into that wisdom that's out there across all the native lands.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we just have a few minutes, but I think it's appropriate for Pat to maybe have the last word. So Pat?
Oh, well, on that same subject, I mean, advisory groups at the higher level of the institution are great, but I just want to also point out that I have sat on advisory committees for Harvard project as far as creating a strategic plan and to determine how they can best serve Native peoples. And I also have presented to the board for Native Nations Institute about the impacts that organization had on our community. So, and that's important that they do get that feedback back from Native communities because, I mean, the universities make decisions all the time. They make decisions about whether something is a really good investment and whether they should, continue it. So I think by having those conversations with communities, especially those communities that have been impacted or supported by the university, is critical. And I do think that those both the University of Arizona and Harvard have come back and engaged their community and asked for support in their planning.
Thank you. I think we're about at the end of our time. Hour and a half went by incredibly quickly. I think our wonderful panelists gave us a lot to think about, but also to act on in the future. I'm very hopeful that we can really move forward on some of these things in a very tangible and meaningful way. So